Okay, let's talk now about the stages of labor. We talked about what happens hormonally to initiate labor. Now let's talk about the actual stages. There's three things that need to happen in a typical labor in order for things to result in a healthy baby and a healthy mom. The first thing is that the baby has to be developed enough to survive in the post-uterine environment. The second thing is that the uterus has to contract and push that baby toward the birth canal. And the third thing is that the cervix has to both dilate and efface in order for the baby to make its way into the birth canal. So we'll talk about some of those processes. In the first stage of labor, contractions are typically strong and regular. They become more regular as that stage progresses. During this stage is when the amniotic sac breaks. Now, the amniotic sac breaking is something that you've maybe seen on movies and is typically shown as a dramatic event in the middle of a grocery store or something, and that absolutely does happen, but there's different ways that the amniotic sac breaks, that it's not always this dramatic gush of fluid, and that really depends on when the amniotic sac breaks. If the amniotic sac breaks early on in labor, when the baby is positioned somewhat like this, then it's more likely to be a noticeable event for the mom, probably a more dramatic event as this gush of fluid comes. If the amniotic sac doesn't break until later in labor, then, so let's look here, if the baby's closer to the birth canal, that baby kind of serves as a cork. So the sac might break, but there might just be a small trickle of fluid, so mom isn't really aware of the amniotic sac breaking. So that can occur very differently, and labor in general occurs very differently for different women because of a lot of factors, different sizes of fetuses, different genetics, different um, bone structures of mom, and lots of different things. So during the first stage, that uterus is contracting quite consistently, pushing the fetus towards the cervix into the birth canal. During this stage, transition happens. Transition is the movement of the fetus from the cervix to the vagina. This is typically very painful. It's one of the most painful parts of labor. It doesn't last an extremely long time. For a first-time mother, it lasts about 30 to 45 minutes. And I imagine that feels like quite a long time. So that transition happens. It's painful, but basically you see transition happening right here as the fetus is making its way through the cervix and into the birth canal. So in order for this to happen, the cervix needs to kind of let the baby through. Now, the cervix is basically just the opening from the uterus to the birth canal. This is the cervix right here. This is the uterus, this is the vaginal canal, the birth canal. And so the cervix is kind of this gateway. Now, a normal cervix, this is what a normal cervix looks like. This would be looking from the vaginal canal at the cervix. It's typically thick, and the opening is quite tight and closed. That's a very small opening. That's a good thing in most instances because it keeps toxins and bacteria out. And so it protects the baby, it protects the uterus even when a mother's not pregnant. But during labor, this type of cervix isn't going to do much good because that baby needs to get out. And so hormones are released that we talked about, and it dilates the cervix. What we mean when we say dilate the cervix is that this opening into the uterus becomes wider. So you hear people say, you know, how much is she dilated? She's a 4. Oh, she still has a ways to go. If she's a 10, then she's pretty close. What that's talking about is that this opening is widening. When we talk about being effaced, we're talking about the tissue of the cervix surrounding the opening. Now, typically that's really thick and sturdy. During labor, that tissue of the cervix becomes thin and flexible to allow the baby to make its way into the birth canal. So dilation is the opening of the cervix becomes wider. Effacement is the tissue of the cervix becomes softer and more flexible so that the baby can make this transition from the uterus into the birth canal. As the baby makes that transition, the fact that the brain isn't well developed is a really good thing, because if the brain was developed, if the skull was fully developed, the infant wouldn't be able to make its way into the birth canal. You may know that infants' skulls do not develop in one piece the way that our skulls are now as adults. They develop in separate pieces that can overlap to make the head thinner as it goes through the birth canal. It makes the head more flexible to make its way through there. That's great. If a baby's brain was as developed as a lot of other mammals' brains are at birth, then birth wouldn't be possible. So it's one of the reasons that the brain is so underdeveloped at birth. We'll talk about more reasons when we talk about brain development. During the second stage of delivery, of labor, we see the baby for the first time. The baby makes an appearance. The head of the infant appears at the opening of the vagina. We call this crowning. And the baby is making his way through the birth canal at this point. Typically for first births, this stage lasts not longer than an hour. For subsequent births, the stage can last as little as 15 or 20 minutes. That's not atypical for subsequent births to deliver very quickly once the baby has made that transition and mom enters the second stage of labor. If the baby reaches this point and is not progressing, then intervention is needed. You read about forceps in your chapter, and it's historically and even today, it's not atypical for babies to kind of get stuck in the birth canal. The birth canal is not a large canal. It's a small little opening. Historically, when that happened, there's nothing they could do, and it was very likely that both mom and baby would die in that process. Babies in stress during this time, it's important that they're not stuck in the birth canal for too long. And so you read about forceps. What forceps would do is go in and go on each side of baby's ears and help the baby through the birth canal. Now, forceps aren't used a lot, I would say probably hardly at all anymore. There's some risks associated with it, some damage to the ears, some nerve damage to the neck that can be problematic. But when forceps were invented, they were the safest way to get the baby here. And it's said that forceps have saved more lives. The only thing that's saved more lives than forceps is antibiotics. So the invention of forceps has been really beneficial, although now they've perfected the C-section so well that if the baby is in distress, they'll most likely opt for a C-section over the use of forceps. So during stage 2, the baby appears, crowns at the base of the vagina, and then is born, all within stage 2. You see here a newborn baby that only a mother could love, right? So here we have the umbilical cord attached to the belly button, and the other end of the umbilical cord is attached to the placenta. Now, the placenta is still inside mom, more uterine contractions are needed to shed that. And so that brings us to the third stage where mom delivers the placenta. So baby's born and then placenta's born. So this umbilical cord is how the baby's getting all of the nutrients during prenatal development. Here you have a picture of the placenta. This is a very blood vessel-rich organ, and doctors typically will examine the placenta quite thoroughly. They'll make sure that all of the main arteries are there, because if they're not, they'll know, oh, maybe the baby wasn't getting all the nutrients they needed, and so we need to kind of be aware and intervene more with the infant if there's problems. They also need to make sure that all parts of the placenta are there, because the placenta doesn't always come off in one piece, and so if it didn't, if there's still parts of the placenta that are missing, then they know there's still something inside mom, and it's important that if that doesn't come out on its own, that they go in and get that, because that can cause infection and lead to some problems. So examination of the placenta is important after birth. So that's kind of an explanation of the stages of typical labor. Hopefully it didn't traumatize you too much. It's really quite a neat process. I've posted a video for you to watch. Some of you may have watched it already, but hopefully that kind of illustrates this process even more. If you are particularly traumatized, I won't require you to watch the video. You can answer all of the questions on your quiz from these PowerPoint notes and the reading of your text. But if you haven't ever seen a birth, I encourage you to watch, because I think that it's insightful into kind of the initiation of postnatal development, and it's quite a unique process. So I'll leave that up to you. Good luck on your quiz.